There are moments in a man's life when everything he thought was solid suddenly feels like sand slipping through his fingers. The breakup itself may have been loud or silent, sudden or slowly unfolding. But the moment it became real, the moment he understood that the chapter was truly over, something inside him shifted. Not just emotionally, but physically, mentally, even spiritually. It's the kind of shift you don't prepare for because you never expect that the person you built routines with, made plans with, or imagined a future with will one day become a stranger. If you are here right now, listening, it's likely because you're standing in that strange, unfamiliar space between what was and what will be. And it is not an easy place to stand. It is a space that pulls at the deepest parts of a man's identity. A space that stirs questions he never thought he would need to ask. Questions like, who am I without her? What happens to my life now? How do I move through the day without feeling the weight of everything I've lost? The truth is, breakups hit men differently. Not necessarily harder, not necessarily deeper, but differently. Many men spend years learning how to stay strong, how to contain their emotions, how to move forward without showing the cracks. Some are told to be problem solvers instead of feelers. Some learned that silence was safer than vulnerability. Some were taught that emotional pain is something you simply get over. But healing does not respond to pressure. Pain does not dissolve just because you tell it to. And pretending that you're unaffected doesn't make the grief disappear. It only pushes it further inside, where it becomes heavier, tighter, harder to carry. So if you feel a kind of heaviness in your chest, if your mind drifts to memories you wish you could shut off, if the future looks uncertain, foggy, or strangely quiet, there is nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're not weak. You are reacting like a human being who cared, who tried, who invested himself in something real. Right now, your body is still catching up with everything that has ended. Your mind is still adjusting to the sudden quiet after months or years of shared noise. Your emotions are still rearranging themselves, trying to find a new rhythm. And your heart is doing what hearts do when someone important leaves, grieving not only the person, but the version of yourself that existed with them. Many men underestimate this part. They think the pain comes only from losing her. But often, the deeper wound comes from losing the life they built around her. The habits, the conversations, the morning rituals, the subtle, everyday ways in which she made the world feel slightly more predictable. After a breakup, those anchors disappear, and the brain, trying to keep you safe, struggles with that emptiness. If your nights feel longer now, if your thoughts are louder, if you feel moments of sudden sadness or sudden anger or sudden confusion, it is not a flaw. It is the natural response to losing something that held meaning. And it is okay to say that it hurts. It is okay to admit that you're tired. It is okay to feel lost. The world often demands that men stay composed during all of this. But you don't have to perform strength here. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to swallow your emotions until they harden. Right now, the most courageous thing you can do is simply allow yourself to be honest. Honest about what this ending has done to you, and honest about the part of you that still doesn't want to let go. This episode is not about telling you to move on. It is not about rushing you into a new chapter. It is about helping you understand the emotional terrain you're standing in. Because when a man understands where the pain comes from, he stops fighting himself and starts healing himself. So let's take this journey slowly. Let's walk through the heartbreak without running from it. Let's look at what actually happens inside a man after a relationship ends, how the mind responds, how the heart reacts, how the identity shifts, and why all of this can become the beginning of something far more powerful than you expect. There's a particular kind of weight men carry after a breakup. It is rarely visible to others. Quiet, internal, often misunderstood. From the outside, it might seem like you're functioning well enough. You show up to work. You keep conversations short but steady. You reply with the familiar, "I'm good," when someone asks how you're doing. You might even distract yourself with tasks, routines, workouts, or noise, anything that keeps your mind from drifting back to what you lost. But underneath that surface, there's a pressure that builds slowly, a tightness behind the ribs, a heaviness in the soul, a constant undercurrent of emotion that doesn't fully surface but never truly leaves. Many men don't have the language for this feeling. They only know that something inside them feels unsettled, unbalanced, incomplete. Part of this weight comes from expectations, both the ones society puts on men and the ones men put on themselves. You may not have realized it before, but the world teaches men from a young age to absorb pain quietly, to be reliable even in emotional chaos, to stay strong, even when strength is the last thing you feel. And so, when heartbreak arrives, the instinct is not to break down, not to express, not to process. The instinct is to endure. But endurance is not healing. Endurance is a holding pattern, necessary at times, but never the destination. The truth is, breakups often disrupt a man's internal architecture more deeply than he expects. Not because he is fragile, but because men often attach meaning in ways they rarely speak about. Men invest through action, through presence, through giving, through planning. When a woman becomes part of a man's life, she becomes integrated into the daily rhythm he builds. And when she leaves, that rhythm collapses, leaving behind empty spaces where certainty used to be. There is the emotional space she occupied, the comfort of being understood, the sense of companionship, the feeling of belonging somewhere specific. There's the mental space, the plans you made, the future you envisioned, the possibility that once felt solid. There's the physical space, the routines, the habits, even the smallest rituals that shaped your day. This trifecta, emotional, mental, physical, creates a deep imprint. And when all three dissolve at once, the loss feels total. That is why men often feel a sudden drop in identity after a breakup. It's not just the loss of the relationship, it's the loss of the structure around which they built so much of their life. Another layer of this hidden weight comes from something far more private: regret. Even in relationships that weren't right, even in breakups that were necessary, there's often a lingering sense of, I could have done more. Maybe there were things left unsaid. Maybe there were mistakes you wish you could take back. Maybe you replay moments in your mind, try to rewrite them. Or maybe the regret comes from the simple fact that endings always reveal things you didn't notice earlier, things you understand only in hindsight. But regret is not the enemy. Regret is a mirror. It shows you where you grew, where you stayed silent, where you gave too much, or where you gave too little. It reveals patterns, not punishments. It highlights the parts of yourself that are ready for evolution. Still, in the early stages, most men don't see regret this way. They see it as failure, as inadequacy, as an invisible wound that keeps pulling their thoughts backward. And because men are rarely taught how to process emotional pain, they often internalize it, believing they need to carry it alone. But you don't. You were never meant to. There's also the pressure of identity. In a relationship, a man often finds meaning through contribution, protecting, supporting, building, showing up. When the relationship ends, that purpose suddenly has no outlet. There's no one to give to, no one to show up for in the same way, no one to anchor the emotional investment that once had a clear direction. And in that vacuum, men often begin to question themselves. Was I enough? Did I matter? What's my role now? These questions are painful, but they're also natural. They arise because your heart is recalibrating, because your sense of identity is shifting, because your subconscious is trying to understand what parts of your life need to be rebuilt and what parts need to be released. And then there's the loneliness, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from losing someone who once knew your world intimately. The one who noticed the small things about you, the one who remembered your routines, the one who listened to your thoughts. When that level of closeness disappears, it creates a silence that feels almost physical. It is normal to fear that silence at first. It is normal to try to fill it with distractions. But that silence is not your enemy. It is the space in which you will rebuild. What you're feeling right now is not weakness. It's the internal restructuring that happens when a chapter ends. You're not collapsing. You are recalibrating. You're not falling apart. You are shedding the emotional weight of something that mattered. And as much as this hurts, this period is also the doorway to a different kind of strength, one you cannot develop when everything is comfortable. Healing after a breakup is not about forgetting her, or proving something, or rushing ahead. It is about understanding the weight you carry so you can finally put it down. Grief after a breakup has a very particular texture. It is not the explosive grief of tragedy, nor the clean grief of finality. It is quieter, a grief that lingers in the pauses of your day. It appears in the empty side of the bed, in the familiar songs that suddenly feel different, in the small habits that used to belong to two people, not one. It is a grief that doesn't announce itself loudly, but it settles slowly, like dust on a surface you haven't touched in a while. Many men underestimate this grief, not because they are unfeeling, but because they have learned to interpret emotional pain through logic. Something ended, therefore move on. Something didn't work, therefore accept it. Something hurt, therefore minimize the impact so you can stay functional. But grief doesn't respond to logic. Grief responds to meaning. And relationships, even imperfect ones, are full of meaning. There was meaning in the way she smiled at you, meaning in the shared routines, meaning in the years or months you spent building a rhythm together, meaning in the moments when you showed up for each other, meaning in the trust you gave, in the effort you invested, in a version of yourself that existed because she was in your life. When that meaning disappears, the heart naturally aches. Not because it is weak, but because it is honest. Grief is the heart's way of acknowledging that something mattered. For many men, this grief is tied to identity in ways they don't fully recognize. Being in a relationship shapes how a man sees himself. As a partner, a protector, a provider of stability, a source of closeness, a contributor to a shared life. When the relationship ends, that identity becomes disoriented. The role you played is gone. The emotional direction you once had becomes unfocused. The routines that supported your sense of purpose dissolve. And in the space left behind, questions arise. Hard questions, human questions. Who am I when I'm not loved by the person I loved? What remains of me now that this chapter is closed? What parts of myself did I lose along the way? What parts of myself are trying to come back now? These questions are not signs of failure. They're signs that something deep inside you is reshaping itself. Heartbreak strips away the noise and reveals the parts of you that need attention. The fears you tried to avoid, the insecurities you pushed aside, the needs you silenced because they felt inconvenient. This is the emotional rebuilding of a man. Not a collapse, but a reconstruction. For some men, this reconstruction begins with anger. Not because anger is the core emotion, but because it is often the first emotion men allow themselves to feel. Anger feels active, protective, like doing something when everything else feels helpless. But underneath the anger, there is often sadness. And underneath the sadness, there is often fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of not finding someone who understands you again. Fear that you are not enough. Fear that something is wrong with you. The healing begins when you allow yourself to acknowledge what lies beneath the anger. Not dramatically, not all at once, just honestly. Once you acknowledge the sadness, it begins to move. Once you acknowledge the fear, it begins to soften. Once you acknowledge the truth, your heart begins to make space for something new. Another important layer in this emotional rebuilding is self-worth. Breakups often shake a man's confidence. You might overanalyze your flaws, replay your mistakes, wonder whether you were difficult to love, compare yourself to other men, question your desirability, your masculinity, your emotional value. But here is something most men forget. Relationships do not end because one person is unlovable. Relationships end because two lives, with all their complexity and inner worlds, no longer align in a way that supports both people. Sometimes it is timing, sometimes communication, sometimes the unspoken emotional wounds each person carries. Sometimes it is simply incompatibility that only becomes clear after the chemistry fades. You did not fail simply because the relationship ended. You grew, you tried, you invested, you learned things about yourself that you would not have learned any other way. That is not failure, that is humanity. And yet, the most powerful shift comes when you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were dormant. When you realize the man you were in that relationship is not the full version of who you can be outside of it. You begin to rediscover interests you forgot about. You start reaching toward goals you paused for too long. You feel sparks of ambition returning, slowly, quietly. You start noticing where you gave too much and where you didn't give enough. You start understanding your emotional boundaries, not as walls, but as clarity. You begin to see that your love, your loyalty, your effort, even your pain, all mean something. Because if a breakup reveals anything, it is the depth of your capacity to feel. And that capacity is not a weakness. It is a strength that few people truly recognize in themselves. Right now, you may feel like a man who has lost something important, but you're also a man standing at the beginning of a new internal chapter. A chapter that is not defined by what ended, but by what comes next. A chapter where you rebuild not from desperation, but from clarity. Not from fear, but from self-respect. Not from loneliness, but from rediscovered identity. Breakups hurt. But for men, the hurt often feels different than what anyone else expects. It is quieter, more internalized, sometimes invisible to the people around them. From the outside, you might appear composed, calm, functional. But inside, the mind and body are navigating a storm that few can see. And this is not weakness. It is attachment. Not just attachment to a person, but to a life, a rhythm, a version of yourself that existed alongside her. Humans are wired for connection. Men, just like women, invest deeply in emotional bonds. But society often teaches men to mask that investment, to carry it privately, to prove resilience through action rather than feeling. So when a relationship ends, the disruption is both emotional and structural. It is a loss not only of a partner, but also of the framework that gave meaning to days, routines, and self-perception. That hidden weight, the part few can see, can be crushing precisely because it is silent. The pain is amplified by what psychologists call unspoken attachments. These are the habits, the shared memories, the unspoken expectations that accumulate over months or years. A man may not consciously notice them until the relationship ends. And when it does, the absence of those attachments creates a vacuum. Simple things, texting her, knowing she would be home at a certain time, sharing a joke only the two of you understood, become missing pieces. The brain keeps circling back. The mind searches for what it cannot replace. The body reacts as if the loss were a threat to survival. It is common for men to overestimate what they lost or underestimate their capacity to recover. Thoughts spiral. I will never feel this connection again. I failed as a partner. I am unlovable. These are not facts. They are emotional projections shaped by attachment and grief. But they feel real, and they feel urgent. And when you're alone with them, even for a few minutes, they can feel overwhelming. Another factor is the social layer. Men rarely have the language or safe spaces to process these emotions publicly. Friends may offer practical advice, dismiss feelings as overreactions, or unintentionally reinforce the idea that a man must tough it out. So much of the pain is carried in silence, creating an echo chamber where thoughts feed on themselves. Over time, this silence deepens the sense of isolation, making the emotional burden feel heavier than it actually is. But here's the essential insight. This depth of feeling is not a flaw. It is evidence of your capacity to connect, to love, to commit, to care. The intensity of the grief is proportional to the depth of investment you made. The more you gave, the more there is to process. And that is entirely human. Healing begins not by ignoring these unspoken attachments, but by acknowledging them. Not by suppressing them, but by giving them space to exist without judgment. To recognize that what you feel is real, meaningful, valid. To understand that the end of a relationship does not erase your worth, your potential, or the love you are capable of giving in the future. A practical way to navigate this weight is to identify the components of attachment that affect you most: emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. Emotional attachment, the feelings, the longing, the grief, the love still present. Cognitive attachment, the thoughts, memories, what-ifs, the mental loops. Behavioral attachment, the routines, habits, and actions that involved her, now absent. By observing each layer without self-judgment, you gain clarity. You begin to see that the pain is not a permanent state, but a signal that certain parts of your inner life need attention. You are not broken. You are adjusting. You are not failing. You are learning. And this is where empowerment begins. Understanding that grief has layers allows you to take micro steps toward rebuilding. Establish routines that honor your needs. Engage in practices that reconnect you with your body and mind. Reclaim aspects of your identity that were lost or subdued. Each small step signals to your system that it is safe to heal. Each conscious action signals to yourself that your life continues, that you have the capacity to move forward. Perhaps most importantly, men need to internalize this truth. Emotional pain does not diminish strength. Processing grief openly, thoughtfully, and with self-compassion is an act of courage. It demonstrates resilience, not weakness. It is an acknowledgement that you are human, capable of deep connection, and capable of rebuilding. This chapter of life, the heartbreak, the silence, the ache, is not an endpoint. It is a turning point. And although the journey is often solitary in its early stages, the path leads to a new form of freedom. A freedom that comes from understanding your emotional architecture, reclaiming your sense of self, and realizing that even after profound loss, you are capable of love, connection, and fulfillment. After understanding the weight you carry and the layers of grief that settle quietly within, the next step is not to rush. It is to reclaim yourself in a way that feels authentic. This is where reflection meets action, where the internal process of healing begins to translate into practical steps you can take daily. And these steps are not dramatic. They're not about pretending everything is fine. They are small, intentional, grounded in self-respect. The first, and perhaps most essential, step is acknowledgement. Simply notice what you feel, without judgment. Name the emotions: sadness, anger, confusion, longing, regret. Allow yourself to recognize that these emotions exist for a reason. They're your heart and mind processing a loss that mattered. Men often avoid this step. They feel pressure to fix themselves or to appear strong. But acknowledgement is not weakness. It is the foundation of every other action you take. You cannot rebuild what you refuse to see. The second step is reclaiming your body. Emotional weight often manifests physically: tight shoulders, shallow breathing, restless sleep, fatigue. Start with small, consistent actions. Stretch, move, walk, breathe deliberately. You do not need to train like a warrior or push to exhaustion. Just move in a way that signals to yourself that your body is alive and responsive. Even 5 minutes of mindful movement can start signaling to your nervous system that you are safe, that you're grounded, that you are beginning to reclaim presence in your own life. The third step is creating a structure of micro-routines. Breakups often dissolve the rhythms that once anchored your days. Morning rituals, shared meals, conversations that punctuated time. You can rebuild this structure intentionally, not as a replacement for her, but as a reclaiming of your autonomy. Simple steps: wake at a consistent hour, journal for a few minutes, Plan your day with small, achievable goals. This is not about overloading yourself. It is about providing your mind and body with predictable signals of stability. Step 4 is expressing your internal world, which may feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Talk to a trusted friend. Write in a journal. Speak aloud to yourself. The goal is not to craft perfect sentences or analyses. It is to allow your emotions to move. When men suppress grief, it stagnates, becoming a silent weight that shapes behavior unconsciously. Expression liberates it. It makes room for clarity, self-awareness, and a gentle unfolding of acceptance. Step 5 is rebuilding identity outside of the relationship. Ask yourself, who am I when I am not defined by my role as a partner? Which interests, skills, and passions have I neglected? Which parts of myself were silenced? This step is about rediscovering the man you are at your core. Begin small, reconnect with hobbies, read something that sparks curiosity, try an activity that challenges you. These are not distractions. They are reconnections with a life and self you are capable of cultivating independently. Step 6 is setting boundaries. It is normal to encounter reminders of your ex, social media posts, mutual friends, familiar places. These triggers are not enemies. They are signals to practice awareness and care. Decide what is necessary for your emotional well-being. Protect your energy. This is not avoidance. It is preservation. It is the conscious act of guarding the fragile new sense of self you are building. Step 7 is cultivating patience and self-compassion. Men often rush to get over a breakup or measure progress in linear terms. Healing is rarely linear. There will be days of clarity and days of heaviness. Some days you will feel like yourself. Other days, lost again. Allow this rhythm. Be patient with yourself as you would with a friend navigating a similar path. Treat your mistakes and regressions not as failures, but as part of the process. Finally, integrate moments of reflection and gratitude. As you rebuild, take stock not only of what was lost, but of what remains. Your capacity to feel, your resilience, your autonomy, your strength. Notice small wins. Acknowledge progress. Celebrate clarity even in subtle doses. This habit trains the mind to recognize forward movement, to cultivate hope, an essential companion in emotional recovery. These steps, when practiced consistently, create a scaffold for the next stage of your life. They allow grief to be honored while preventing it from defining you. They turn internal weight into insight, lingering sadness into awareness, confusion into clarity. Over time, they create momentum. Momentum that is steady, deliberate, and rooted in self-respect rather than desperation. Remember, this is not about rushing to replace what was lost. It is about rebuilding from the inside out. Becoming a man who can face the world with honesty, integrity, and emotional presence. Reclaiming your sense of self, not as a response to absence, but as a deliberate affirmation of your worth. The journey after a breakup is not a punishment. It is an initiation. A period of transformation, subtle but profound. And by taking these steps, however small at first, you are beginning a process that will leave you stronger, more self-aware, more capable of meaningful connection in the future. After the storm of heartbreak, after the grief and the reflection, comes a quieter, subtler work, integration. This is the stage where the lessons, the emotions, and the insights you've gathered begin to form a coherent sense of self. You start to feel the edges of your identity smoothing out, even if the ache hasn't fully disappeared. You begin to recognize that you're not defined solely by the relationship that ended, nor by the pain it left behind. You are defined by your choices, your awareness, your capacity to continue with intention. Integration begins with acceptance. Acceptance does not mean forgetting her or pretending that everything is fine.